Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations, and through these discussions, you will learn why the majority of the time, the book wins. Having said that, I am a huge movie buff, and do give unbiased reviews for both the book and the movie, ultimately. So whether you love books, movies, or both, this is the perfect podcast for you. This probably goes without saying, but there will be spoilers for both the book and the movie in this episode. So if you plan on reading the book or watching the movie, go do that first and then come back and listen to this. And now, without further ado, let's get right into it. Hi, thanks for tuning into today's episode. We are talking about Wiseguy by Nick Pileggi, published in 1985. And that was the basis for the incredibly popular movie Goodfellas, directed by Martin Scorsese, released in 1990. And I mean, is there anyone out there that hasn't at least heard of the movie Goodfellas? It is the movie that solidified Scorsese as one of the greatest filmmakers of our time. Prior to this, he had done Taxi Driver and Raging Bull, which are both considered masterpieces, but Goodfellas just brought him, I guess, more widespread notoriety and more success. And a quick summary for those who don't know the story. We follow Henry Hill. He started out being involved with the mob when he was 12 as an errand boy, growing up on Long Island, somewhere around there. Even though he wasn't one of the big guys in the mafia, he was rubbing shoulders with everyone and he was very well connected. When he was 37, he was arrested for narcotics, and this situation put him in a position where the mob couldn't trust him and wanted him dead. He did the only thing he could, and he gave up names and helped get his former friends convicted and put in prison, and he in return had to go into the witness protection program and leave his life of crime behind. So my thoughts on the book. I was actually surprised how much I liked this book. There were times when it talked in detail about certain schemes they had going on, specifically the basketball point shaving scheme, that maybe it could have been summed up rather than kind of explained and drawn out. Having said that, though, it never dragged. And the book shares Karen's perspective as well, and even the perspective of one of Henry's earlier girlfriends. And even though I didn't like Henry per se, he could be kind of a scumbag, but I didn't hate him either, so there was something kind of likable about him in a way. And as a woman, I really appreciated that Karen's point of view was told, and I really liked her sections. I have seen the movie before, and I remembered it fairly well. But even so, this book was so entertaining, even though you know what's going to happen. And this is the first, mafia book I've read, and I was just so engrossed. And I will definitely be reading more again at some point, specifically Casino, which was also written by Nicholas Pileggi. So yeah, I didn't think I'd be quite as into it as I was. And this book was written by the crime journalist Nicholas Pileggi. And so since he focused on writing about the mafia, during his career, he had met with various people involved with the mob. And when he met Hill, he discovered he wasn't like any of the others, saying, "Hill was a surprising man. He didn't look or act like most of the street hoods I had come across. He spoke coherently and fairly grammatically. He smiled occasionally. He knew a great deal about the world in which he had been raised, and he spoke about it with an odd detachment, and he had an outsider's eye for detail. Most of the mobsters who have been interviewed for books and articles over the years have been unable to detach themselves from their experiences long enough to put their lives in some perspective. They so blindly followed the mobster's path that they rarely saw any of the scenery along the way. Henry Hill was all eyes. He was fascinated by the world in which he had grown up, and there was very little about it that he did not remember." So on to the movie. The movie had to change the title because they didn't want it to be confused with a show that was called Wiseguy that was out at that same time, and so they didn't want people getting it confused. Plus, there was another movie that was called Wiseguy, two separate words, but still it was similar enough that they needed to change the name. And an annoying thing about the movie is at one point in the voiceover, Ray Liotta, the guy who plays Henry Hill, he explains to us what a good fella is, basically explaining to us why the movie has that title. And they should have instead just called each other Goodfellas here and there throughout the movie, and that would have been us. That would have been enough for us to understand why it had that name. In the voiceover, he says that they call each other Goodfellas, but they never, not once, call each other Goodfella throughout the whole movie. So I don't know. In the book, he uses the word wise guy all the time, and so you get why it's called a wise guy, because that term is used frequently. Whereas the movie never once uses the word good fella. And then in the voiceover near the end, he's like, yeah, we call each other a good fella. It's like, no, you never did. So that kind of bugged me. But Scorsese and Pileggi worked together on the script, and it follows the book extremely close. So much of the script is pulled word for word from the book. There is the famous opening line where he says, it's from the movie, where he says, as far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster. And that doesn't come directly from the book, but the book does have the line that says, at age 12, it was my ambition to be a gangster. So pretty close. And the movie has a lot of lines that just come straight from the book, and which in turn had come straight from Henry's mouth when he was interviewed by Pileggi. Which it was interesting because Henry Hill was still in witness protection program and he was wanting someone to write his story. And so Pileggi got wind of it. And because he was still in witness protection program, Pileggi was met by federal officers at the airport, and they didn't tell him where he was going, but they met him there, and then they got on a plane going somewhere. And then from there, they flew somewhere else where they there met where they met Henry Hill, who had his own federal officers with him. And so it was just interesting how much security and secrecy was involved because there were still people alive that wanted him dead. Anyway, on to the acting in the movie. So Ray Liotta is in the lead role of Henry Hill. He wanted the role, and at one point he was trying to talk to Scorsese about, trying to get the role. And Scorsese had guards around him at the time because people were picketing against him due to his latest film and like threatening his life or something. I don't know. But anyway, so the guards were being very persistent and kind of, being rude with Liotta, telling him not to get near. But Liotta remained very calm and patient, and this caught Scorsese's attention because Hill was very calm under pressure. And so this experience made Scorsese believe Liotta was the right choice. Robert De Niro is, of course, excellent as Jimmy. The real Jimmy, his last name was Jimmy Burke, but in the movie they changed everybody's last name. So like now I can't remember what his last name is in the movie, but Jimmy, Polly, Tommy, they all have different names from book to movie because they had to change their identities for the movie basically. Anyway, so in the book his name is Jimmy Burke. And De Niro and Scorsese have done so many movies together, and they always produce something amazing. And yeah, De Niro is really well cast as Jimmy. In the book, he's describing Jimmy, saying how he could have it out for you and you would never even know. And it says, Jimmy could look at you and smile and you'd think you were sitting with your best friend in the world. Meanwhile, he's got your grave dug. In fact, the week Jimmy killed Remo had just given Jimmy and Mickey a round trip ticket to Florida as an anniversary present. So basically, he could be very cold-hearted, even though he's acting friendly, but yeah. And then Joe Pesci plays the sociopath Tommy, and him being a sociopath is just my armchair diagnosis. But Pesci won an Oscar for his performance, which kind of surprised me. I guess because now, this is 30 years later, and we're all accustomed to the kind of characters Pesci plays. And so his role, in this movie didn't seem revolutionary. But when this came out, though, he was newer and a more unknown actor. So this was, his first role like this. It wasn't, now 30 years later where we've seen him do this role so many times. And I'm not saying he's not good, because he is great in this role. He just always seems to play these kind of characters now. In the book, Henry describes Tommy saying, "You couldn't get around with Tommy. He was wired very tight. One of Tommy's brothers had ratted people out years ago, and he was always living that down. He always had to show he was tougher than anyone around. He always had to be special. He was the only guy in the crew that used to drink Crown Royal. It was a Canadian whiskey that wasn't imported back then when he was a kid. Tommy had it smuggled in. He was the kind of guy who was being so tough, he managed to find bootleg hooch to drink 30 years after Prohibition." And then Lorraine Bracco plays Henry's wife, Karen. She and Liotta were both about 36 when making this movie. And in the beginning, they're supposed to be 20 or 18 years old. So when they first meet, they clearly look too old for the role. But by the end, they look the right age. And Bracco is great in this movie. She has a lot of scenes where she is yelling and being very dramatic, and she sells it. She's good in those over-the-top scenes. But then there's another scene that comes to mind when the cops are coming to search the house. And in the voiceover, we hear how this is a very common occurrence. And we see her being polite to them. And then she sits she opens the door for them and offers them coffee, and then she goes and sits in front of the TV with her baby. And just like the way she looks, you can tell she's just trying to detach from what is going on and the fact that this is happening so often. And I don't know, I thought that was just a really good scene. She has lots of good scenes though. And as far as the book to movie changes, honestly, this movie follows the book extremely close. Some events are left out or scenes that are shortened, then, other scenes might be shuffled around. But overall, like as far as talking about what is different between the two, there's honestly not that much that's different. One thing I thought was interesting that was left out is that Henry Hill went into the military at age 18 and he serves for 2 years. And he could come home often though, and he would visit his crew, and he also found ways to hustle and make money while he was in the military. For example, he worked in the kitchen and they would order extra food to make sure they had enough, and he would take the extra food and sell it to local restaurants. And then with the Lufthansa robbery, the movie follows closely the true story of that, and just from beginning to the end, they follow it very closely. One thing the movie did leave out was the details on the guy who worked at the airport and had planned the whole thing. In the movie, I believe they make it seem like it's Frenchie, that he works at the airport and he's the one doing it, but that wasn't the case. Which, by the way, the guy who plays Frenchie, you may recognize him because he is in an episode of The Office where he plays an insurance salesman, and Dwight and Andy convince Michael that he's part of the mafia, even though he's just a salesman. But anyway, so you might recognize him from that. But in the book, in the true story, the guy who worked at the airport, his name was Warren, and he planned this whole robbery, and he and a friend were kind of shopping it around bars and stuff, trying to find someone to do this heist for them, because they couldn't actually do it, but they had just planned it all out and would do it with someone else and then share the profit. And then when he got the guys interested and they were officially making plans to make it happen, Warren just started blabbing about it to everyone he knew. And so after the robbery actually took place, it was very easy. Like, he was soon arrested and sentenced because he had confessed it to everyone he knew. However, after his arrest, things kind of went stagnant. They knew Jimmy and the guys did it, but they didn't have enough solid evidence to actually arrest him. In the book and movie, Jimmy basically has everyone who was involved in Lufthansa whacked, as they say. Aside from Tommy, who ends up being killed by other people because he had killed Billy Batts, who was a made man. And you can't kill a made man unless you get permission. Anyway, the montage in the movie where they showed those who Jimmy had killed is such a great scene. Like, the soundtrack that's playing and just... Yeah, this movie has a great soundtrack, by the way. And so just that montage, that was a great scene. And the book also describes the heist in detail in a very cinematic writing style. However, the movie doesn't show the actual crime at all, and we just hear about it the next day when Henry finds out. So I was kind of surprised they didn't show the heist because it's described so detailed in the book. And then Hill ends up being arrested for drugs because a college kid who dealt drugs was caught by the cops, or the feds or whoever, and he agrees to help them catch guys who are in the mafia. And the movie touches on this, but they go more in depth about it in the book. And when Hill is arrested, the movie shows him in jail for an unknown amount of time, but it seems short, and he's telling Karen that she needs to get him out of there. He wants to make things right with Polly so that he can be safe. But in the book, he is in jail for 2 weeks or something like that. And he's being questioned, and when they go to get him from his cell, he's just really loud and loudly and making a fuss and saying how he's not going to tell him anything. And the reason he's putting on such a show is because Polly has people in prison that report back to Polly, and so he wants to make it obvious he's not telling them anything. However, once he's behind doors with them, he is very calm and he's, not being difficult. He doesn't agree to help the cops, but he doesn't tell them no either. And then when he does leave on bail, it's very sudden and the cops had been surprised. When he is in jail, though, Jimmy's wife keeps calling Karen to ask about Henry. And, she's just calling on behalf of Jimmy because Jimmy wants to know what's going on with Henry and if he's ratting them out or not. Henry, because he's in jail for those 2 weeks, it's a suspicious amount of time. And so they start thinking that he is ratting them out, or at least thinking about doing so. And while Hill is still in jail during that time, Jimmy calls up Karen telling her he has things for her to pick up. When she does go over there, things are suspicious and she ends up getting a bad vibe and leaving in a hurry. And the movie has this scene where Jimmy is clearly setting her up to be killed by one of his men. However, in the movie, this happens when Henry is already out of jail and Karen went voluntarily to go see Jimmy. So a little change as far as that goes. And then also while Henry's in prison, Polly tells Karen that he has to turn his back on Henry. He had warned Henry not to get involved in drugs, but Henry did anyway. And so then he gives her some money and then goes on his way. In the movie, they switched this. After Henry's out of jail, he goes to see Polly. And the same event happens where Polly tells him, he can't help him out. But so it's Polly telling Henry himself rather than him telling Karen. And the book talks about how in the end, Hill didn't save himself in some exciting way like it is in the movies. And it reads, "In the end, there were no pyrotechnics, no fiery blasts of Cagney's gangster glory. Henry was not going out through a hole in the top of the world. He was going to survive any way he could. In fact, out of the entire crew, Henry alone managed to survive." And then with the witness protection program, the first 5 years being in the witness protection program, Hill was testifying against people, and so he would be flown out regularly to New York, like a couple times a year to go to court. And he pointed out Polly and Jimmy and others, looking them in the eye as he did so. The book reading, "Henry's confrontations with his old pals on the witness stand left him unmoved. Neither Jimmy Burke's threatening glares nor the sight of the 70-year-old Paul Vario seemed to disturb him. Vario, Burke, Mazzy, Basil, the basketball players, everyone Henry had committed crimes with became bargaining chips he used to buy his own freedom. Leaving his mafia life was a hard adjustment, and he continued drinking and doing drugs. And after he was done testifying, he and Karen stayed together for 3 more years before divorcing. In the books afterward, we learned that Henry was able to leave the program in 1996 upon the death of Jimmy Burke. He continued to have problems with the law for drunk driving arrests until 2006, when the actor Ray Liotta, who plays him in Goodfellas, convinced him to enter a serious rehabilitation program. After many earlier attempts, Hill says it finally worked. And then I've mentioned the basketball shaving scheme. And so in the movie, it shows drugs as being the main way Henry is making money and how Jimmy is in on it too. But he was dealing drugs in real life, but I don't think Jimmy was involved. But Jimmy was involved with the point shaving scheme. And so in the book, Hill and some others paid off 3 college basketball players who played for Boston to ensure that their team wins or loses within a certain number of points. And then they bet on the game, and then the players make sure that happens, and then they win a lot of money. And so this keeps Henry busy because he will often fly down or drive down or whatever to go see the games and to meet with the players and to, make sure they're keeping up their end of the deal. Which that was really interesting. I don't know if that's still happening, but now, I'm not much of a sports person, but it makes you think, wow, especially with college basketball, I guess maybe, how many of these people are being paid off to win or lose by a certain amount. I don't know. It's interesting. But one thing I thought was interesting just with the mafia lifestyle Henry was living is how he didn't have consistent money. I imagined he would, but 1 minute he had more money than he knew what to do with, but then the next minute he was broke. However, the times when he had no money, it didn't really bother him because he knew there was money just around the corner because they just always had so many things cooking, And he could also just borrow money from friends. They knew he would be good on it. And then, but also we see how people were just killed at the drop of a hat. Sometimes a person didn't even know that they were dead because know that they were going to be dead because it would just come so out of the blue. And yeah, they wouldn't hesitate to kill a close friend or even a family member, as we see with Jimmy being willing to have Karen killed. And of course, they wanted Henry killed. And then you have Henry who turns them all in and seems to not be bothered by it. So pretty ruthless. And the movie and book have Henry's monologue talking about how hard it was to leave the life, even with the life-threatening aspect. And he says, "The hardest thing for me was leaving the life I was running away from. Even at the end, with all the threats I was getting and all the time I was facing behind the wall, I still loved the life. We walked into the room and the place stopped. Everyone knew who we were, and we were all treated like movie stars with muscle. We had it all, and it was free. And now all of that is over, and that's the hardest part. Today, everything is very different. No more action. I have to wait around like everyone else. I'm an average nobody. I get to live the rest of my life like a schnook." And random side note, at the time of the book and movie, a mob member could only become a made man if he was full Italian. And so Henry and Jimmy would never have been able to because their dads weren't Italian, but their moms were. But in 2000, this rule was changed. So now you can become a made man as long as your father is Italian, because your last name needs to be Italian, but your mother can be whatever ethnicity. Even with this new rule, though, Henry and Jimmy wouldn't have been able to become made men because, like I said, their dads were the ones that weren't Italian. But I thought it was kind of interesting they changed that rule. So on to Karen. I am so glad the movie kept the scenes where the story is told from Karen's perspective. We get more of it in the book, but I think the movie still does her justice for the most part. In the book, it goes more into Karen finding out about Henry's first girlfriend. In the book, her name is Linda, but in the movie, they changed it to Janice. The movie keeps some key scenes, like when Karen comes over to her apartment to confront Janice, as well as the scene when she wakes Henry up and she's pointing a gun at him. And about the scene with the gun, in the book, Karen says, "I wanted him to know how desperate I had become, but I still couldn't hurt him. How could I hurt him? I couldn't even bring myself to leave him. The truth was, no matter how bad I felt, I was still very attracted to him. He could be incredible. He had a side that was so nice you wanted to bottle it up. He was sweet, considerate, sincere, soft. He had no sharp edges. He wasn't like the other guys around him. He was young, and I was just attracted. My sisters used to say I was obsessed with him because whenever he and I split up for a few days or even a couple of weeks, I never talked about anything else. Whenever we got back together after a brief separation, he always swore it was forever. No more Linda. I wanted to believe him, and I think he wanted to believe it." In the book, before she knows about the affair, she says how she would see Linda around and Linda would always be crying, like at parties and at restaurants and at the office Henry went to. And there was one party in particular where Karen goes in the bathroom and she sees Linda in there crying, and she gives her a handkerchief and is like, whatever guy's making you cry like this, he's not worth it. So the irony. The movie also includes the part of her section where she talks about how a normal girl would have not continued to see Henry as soon as he handed her a gun to hide. And this is the gun he used to pistol whip the guy who had harassed Karen. And the book reads, "I've talked to people since those days, and I guess I must have had a predisposition for that life in the first place. I know there are women who would have gotten out of there the minute their boyfriend gave them a gun to hide. A gun, they would have yelled. Eek, who needs you? Get lost. That's what a lot of girls, my own girlfriends, would have said the minute some guy put a gun in their hands. But I've got to admit the truth. It turned me on." In the end of the book, she also says that part of her was glad to go into witness protection program because her mom could smother a person with just... And the movie kind of shows this, but the book shows it more, how the mom was just really controlling and very pushy with her opinions. And so Karen was glad to get some space. And she was also happy to just be done with the mob life as well, though I'm sure she had a hard time adjusting to new life. And there were also times when their identities were compromised and they would have to leave a town suddenly, without even saying goodbye to anybody. And then about Billy Batts, a crazy part of the book and movie is when Tommy kills Billy Batts and just everything that ensues because of that. And the movie follows what happened, same as the book, very closely. But the movie does add the scene where they go have dinner with Tommy's mom while Batts is in the trunk. And the actor who plays Batts has been friends with Pesci since they were kids. And then the actress who plays Tommy's mom is Scorsese's own mother. And then, in the end, whether I choose the book or the movie, this is a tough one. The movie, it's a masterpiece and it's part of cinema history. Although the movie does have some racist scenes that weren't in the book. More specifically, the movie says the N-word a few times, whereas the book never did. And there were also, the movie also has a scene where Tommy's girlfriend is talking about Sammy Davis Jr. in a racist way. And, I don't doubt that the mob members are or can be racist. I guess I didn't see the point in Scorsese adding those scenes, though. It didn't seem necessary. But for the most part, the movie does stay surprisingly close to the truth when it comes to Henry Hill. He had an interesting story that didn't need embellishments, and Scorsese is a director who knows when to leave well enough alone. I think I still would say, though, that the book wins ultimately. The movie, it's become so iconic. And when I read the book, I imagined their movie counterparts, because how could I not? And if you like the movie, I would definitely suggest reading the book, and vice versa. But the story is just so fascinating, and like I said, the book is so well written, and you get a feel for each of the characters, especially Henry and Karen, obviously. And then you just learn so much about what goes on in the mafia. And yeah, it's just so entertaining. So yeah, I think I would probably read the book again sooner than go watch the movie again. But at this point, I've also seen the movie a number of times. Whereas I've only read the book once. So I don't know. I still think I would end up going with the movie ultimately. Sorry, I mean the book. So yeah, the book wins on this one. But the movie is obviously fantastic. And yeah, I guess that wraps it up for A Wiseguy and Goodfellas. And I hoped you enjoyed this coverage of it. And I would love to hear your thoughts on the book and movie. And next week is Thanksgiving, so I will be taking next week off. I won't be posting any podcast, but I will be back the following week. And I plan to be posting a podcast for House of Gucci, which comes out the week of Thanksgiving. So I'm planning on reading the book, and then I'll go see that movie right when it comes out, and then get a podcast out the first week of December. And I'll be posting a podcast every week in December, even during Christmas. However, I will be taking the first couple weeks off in January is the plan. But yeah, I guess that's it as far as updates go. I do have a YouTube channel, just a reminder, youtube.com/c/whythebookwins. So I post a lot of YouTube only content on there. So go over there and subscribe to my channel. It would mean so much to me. And if you enjoy listening to this podcast, it would also mean so much to me if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcast. Even if you listen to this podcast on other platforms, reviews on Apple Podcast are the most helpful. So yeah, right now I have 3 reviews that people have written. So yeah, I would love to get another one in there. And yeah, I would really appreciate it. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed listening to this. And I will see you again in 2 weeks for House of Gucci. Thanks again for listening. If you want to find me on other platforms, you can check out my Facebook, so facebook.com/whythebookwins, or my Instagram, which is all one word, whythebookwins, or you can go to my website, whythebookwins.com. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can reach out to me on any of those. I also have a Buy Me a Coffee account where you can show your support by donating a couple bucks to the podcast. So that's buymeacoffee.com/whythebookwins. But the fact that you are simply listening to the podcast means a lot to me, and I really appreciate it. And don't forget to subscribe and follow and tune in next Wednesday for the latest episode of Why the Book Wins.